My daughter-in-law slapped me in front of my son, and he just stood there. Silent. That moment shattered everything inside me. I walked away quietly, but deep inside, something dangerous awakened. They thought I was broken. They had no idea what was coming next. Before continue, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and crimson, when I decided to visit my son and his wife. I had carried a basket of fresh fruits, some homemade pickles, and a heart full of warmth. It had been a while since I'd seen them, and I thought a surprise visit would bring smiles and laughter. As I reached their house, I paused for a moment, adjusting my shirt and taking a deep breath. My hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from excitement. I stepped inside after the door creaked open, expecting the familiar warmth of family. But what I walked into was colder than an empty winter night. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My daughter-in-law stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed, her sharp eyes fixed on me with an expression I couldn't recognize, irritation, maybe even anger. My son sat on the couch, hunched over his phone, avoiding my gaze completely, as though my presence was an unwelcome disturbance. I placed the basket on the glass table and smiled softly, trying to ease the tension. The silence stretched, growing heavier with every passing second. I spoke, my voice gentle, breaking the stillness, but before I could even finish my sentence, everything exploded. Without warning, her hand rose, and then it came crashing down on my face. The sharp sting burned like fire against my cheek. The sound echoed in the room, louder than thunder, louder than my heartbeat, louder than the world itself in that moment. For a second, the room spun around me. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a strange hollowness deep inside my chest, as if something precious had just been ripped away. I turned toward my son instinctively, expecting him to stand up, to say something, to do anything, but he didn't. He just sat there, frozen, his head lowered, his silence louder than any words. That silence stabbed deeper than the slap. My son, the boy I had raised with my own hands, the one I had sacrificed everything for, sat there and let it happen. I swallowed hard, fighting back the storm raging inside me. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the tidal wave of emotions I couldn't control: hurt, anger, humiliation, disbelief. My vision blurred, but I refused to let them see me break. I straightened my shoulders, steadied my breath, and walked slowly toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of years of love and sacrifice was pressing down on my chest. I didn't look back, not even once. I knew if I did, I'd see the pieces of my dignity lying shattered on their floor. When the cool air outside touched my burning cheek, I inhaled deeply, forcing my emotions back into the quietest corners of my mind. My body moved, but my heart felt numb, my thoughts spiraling in silence. That night, I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, something inside me shifted, like a dormant fire finally finding air. That slap wasn't just an insult, it was an awakening. It wasn't just my daughter-in-law's arrogance or my son's silence. It was the realization that the love and respect I had built my life upon no longer existed. I walked home under the dim streetlights, each step carrying more than just my body. It carried a promise. A quiet, unspoken vow that this humiliation would not be forgotten. That night, a part of me died. But another part, the part they didn't know existed, had just been born. That night, sleep became a stranger I couldn't find, no matter how tightly I closed my eyes. I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the ticking clock on the wall. Each tick felt heavier than the last, like it was hammering the memory into my skull over and over again: the slap, the silence, the humiliation. I replayed every second in my mind, as though my thoughts were stuck on repeat. The sting on my cheek still burned as if a palm had left an invisible scar, and the emptiness inside me deepened each time I remembered my son sitting there, doing nothing, saying nothing, being nothing. The street outside was quiet, but my mind wasn't. It was chaos. Memories of his childhood played like broken film reels: his first bicycle, the night he cried over scraped knees, the day I saved up enough to buy him his first school uniform. All those years of sacrifice, all the nights I skipped meals to make sure he was fed, all the mornings I woke before sunrise to work overtime. And this was my reward. I couldn't understand how the boy I raised with my own hands could sit on that couch and watch me crumble without flinching. The thought kept twisting inside me like a knife, deeper and deeper, until it was no longer pain, it was fury. I sat up, resting my elbows on my knees, burying my face in my palms. My chest felt heavy, my throat burned, and for the first time in years, tears escaped my control. But they didn't last long. I wiped them away almost as soon as they came. That wasn't who I was. By the time the first light of dawn spilled through the curtains, the anger inside me had started to settle into something colder. Not forgiveness. Not acceptance. Something else. A quiet, dangerous stillness. I realized something as I watched the sun rise. No one was coming to save me. No one was going to fight for me. Not my son. Not anyone. So, I would fight for myself. For the next few days, I kept to myself. I didn't call, didn't visit, didn't ask for explanations. To them, it must have seemed like I had accepted what happened. But inside, I was planning. Slowly, patiently, like a storm that gathers far from the shore, unseen but inevitable. I stopped blaming myself for raising a son who chose silence over loyalty. I stopped questioning why my daughter-in-law carried such venom for me. I realized none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was balance. And balance demanded that I take back what was stolen from me, not just dignity, but control. Every night after that was the same, long, restless, heavy with thoughts. I sat by the window, staring out at the streetlights, my mind replaying their laughter, their arrogance, the look on her face when she struck me, the way my son refused to meet my eyes. Those memories became fuel, feeding the quiet fire growing inside me. I thought about the house they lived in, the car they drove, the clothes they wore, the life they flaunted. I had been the one who laid the first bricks of that life. My sacrifices built that roof over their heads, but now that same roof was where my dignity had been shattered. The irony cut deeper than any wound. One thing became clear to me in those sleepless nights: forgiveness wasn't an option. I promised myself something as I sat there, watching the darkness stretch endlessly into morning. I would rise again, and when I did, they would regret thinking they could break me. They thought I was weak, that I would walk away quietly, that I would shrink into the shadows. They didn't know what I was capable of when the fire inside me was lit. They thought the slap ended the story. They didn't know it had just begun. The following days passed in silence, but inside me, there was a storm no one could hear. The anger no longer burned hot and wild. It had settled into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. I didn't act on impulse. I waited. I watched. I thought. Revenge isn't about rage. Rage fades. But patience. Patience builds power. I started observing them from a distance, learning their patterns without them realizing it. My son and his wife thought I had disappeared into shame, but I was only sharpening my knife in the shadows. I began speaking to people quietly, neighbors, distant relatives, old friends still connected to the business world. I kept my tone casual, my question simple, but each answer was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. It didn't take long before I discovered their weakness: money. Their perfect, flashy life was a hollow shell built on crumbling foundations. My son had invested nearly everything he had into a new business venture, a boutique company that his wife insisted would make them wealthy beyond imagination. She had convinced him to take out loans far larger than he could handle, gambling their stability for her hunger for status. I dug deeper. I called an old friend from my working days, someone who owed me more favors than he'd care to admit. Within hours, I had documents in my hands, loan details, investor reports, credit statements. The picture was clear now. They were living a life they couldn't afford, balancing their comfort on a fragile string that could snap with the slightest pull. I smiled for the first time in days. This wasn't about revenge yet. This was reconnaissance. I needed to know where to strike, and now I did. Their pride wasn't built on love or loyalty. It was built on money, image, and power. So I decided I wouldn't confront them directly. Not yet. I would take away the very thing they worshipped most, the foundation of their arrogance. But my daughter-in-law. Oh, she made it personal. Every memory of her smirk, every cruel word she'd ever spoken, every ounce of disrespect she'd poured on me, all of it fed the fire inside me. If she thought I was some weak, aging man she could humiliate and discard, she was about to learn otherwise. One evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in my hands. Outside, the street was quiet, but my mind was alive with strategies. I thought of chess, how every move matters, how victory belongs to the one who plans 10 steps ahead. They had made the first move, striking me when I least expected it. Now it was my turn, and I would make every step count. I began reaching out to people in the business community who knew me, people who still respected my name, people who had once trusted me with their own deals. I planted small seeds of doubt, just enough to shake investor confidence in my son's company. Quietly, subtly, carefully, I pushed whispers into the right ears. I wasn't reckless. I didn't want them to see me coming. The beauty of revenge lies in silence. When you move quietly, they never realize you've set the trap until it's already closing around them. Within a week, I started seeing tiny signs. A delayed payment here. A supplier hesitating there. Nothing big enough for them to suspect sabotage, but enough to make cracks appear in the smooth surface of their empire. I didn't rush. Revenge isn't served hot. It's served cold, slow, and steady, until the very people who thought they controlled everything realized they're standing on sinking ground. That slap had lit a fire in me, but I wasn't going to burn wildly, I was going to burn precisely. For now, I stayed silent, keeping my distance, letting them believe I had vanished into shame. But inside, I carried a promise carved deep into my chest. The time would come when I'd make them feel everything I felt that night. And when that moment arrived, they wouldn't just lose money. They'd lose everything. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I knew from the very beginning that this wasn't going to be a quick strike. No, this had to be slow, deliberate, and silent, like poison dripping drop by drop until it finally takes hold. A storm destroys everything in one blow, but I didn't want destruction just yet. I wanted control. The first step was simple. I had to break their confidence without them realizing where the blow was coming from. They were living in a bubble, convinced of their untouchable power, thinking their wealth and status made them invincible. That arrogance was my weapon. I reached out to one of my oldest friends, someone I hadn't spoken to in years but who still owed me a favor. He worked closely with some of the key investors tied to my son's business. I invited him over one evening. Over tea, I casually slipped details into the conversation, half-truths mixed with carefully chosen facts. I painted just enough doubt to make them question the stability of my son's company without pointing any fingers. It didn't take long before whispers began to circulate among the right people. Investors hate uncertainty more than anything, and uncertainty spreads faster than wildfire. Within a few weeks, I started hearing the faint rumblings of hesitation, phone calls, private meetings, subtle changes in tone when they spoke to my son. He didn't know it yet, but the walls around him were already beginning to crack. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to my daughter-in-law. Her pride wasn't in the business. Her pride was in appearances. She lived for status, attention, and envy. Her entire existence revolved around the image she built: designer clothes, expensive dinners, lavish vacations. I knew exactly where to strike. I began dropping quiet, strategic words into the right ears at social gatherings. Subtle things. Never accusations, just hints. One person whispers to another that maybe the money isn't flowing like before. Another mentions they heard a small disagreement between her and my son over unpaid bills. People love gossip more than they love truth, and soon enough, the same friend she used to boast to began questioning her behind her back. And when the world stops admiring you, it starts mocking you. I didn't stop there. I began gathering allies, people who had once been close to her but quietly resented her arrogance. I didn't have to convince them to help me. They were eager for it. One by one, doors began closing for her. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. Her carefully built social circle started collapsing like a fragile house of cards. All of this was happening around them, and they still had no idea. They believed I had retreated into silence, licking my wounds, too broken to fight back. That belief kept them blind. One night, as I sat at my kitchen table, I looked at the papers scattered before me: business statements, investor reports, social connections mapped out like a web. Each line, each name, each detail was a string I could pull when the time was right. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was strategy. The trap was set, but I wasn't rushing to spring it. I wanted them to feel safe, secure, untouched. I wanted them to believe the ground beneath them was solid, all while knowing it was hollowing beneath their feet. And then, one evening, I overheard something that made me pause. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that my son had doubled down on a risky deal to impress his wife, convinced it would make them richer than ever. They had invested nearly everything into it. That was the moment I realized the timing was perfect. One wrong whisper, one well-placed doubt, one subtle move, and everything they'd built could crumble in a matter of weeks. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my tea slowly, feeling the quiet satisfaction seep into my veins. The first domino was in position. The rest would follow soon enough. This wasn't anger anymore. This was power. And they had no idea that their undoing had already begun. The first cracks started showing sooner than I expected. It began with small things only someone watching closely would notice. A delayed payment to one of their suppliers. A cancelled dinner reservation at an upscale restaurant. A few unexpected calls from creditors, all politely inquiring about pending dues. I stayed quiet. I didn't make a move, didn't say a word. Silence has a strange power. It lets the world unravel on its own, and that's exactly what I wanted. One evening, I sat by the window sipping tea, watching the streetlights flicker in the distance. My phone buzzed. It was my son. For the first time in weeks, he was calling me. I let it ring until it stopped, and then I stared at the dark screen for a long moment, a faint smile pulling at the corner of my lips. I didn't need to hear his voice to know what he wanted. The panic had begun. Soon after, I started hearing whispers in the business community. The investors were nervous, suppliers were restless, and clients had begun pulling out of deals. The unstoppable company they had built was suddenly being doubted from every angle. My quiet whispers had taken root, and now the vines of uncertainty were choking them slowly. But the true unraveling wasn't in the business. It was in their home. My daughter-in-law, once the queen of her little social empire, had begun to notice the shift. The lavish invitations stopped coming. Friends who used to swarm her with compliments now gave polite smiles from a distance. People she once mocked were suddenly avoiding her gaze. Her status was slipping, and I knew her pride couldn't handle it. I heard from a distant cousin that they'd had a loud argument at a family gathering. She blamed my son for listening to bad advice, while he accused her of pushing him into risky investments. Voices were raised, tears were shed, and the perfect image they had built for themselves started crumbling in front of everyone. And yet, my son still didn't call to apologize. Not once. Not a single word about that day. That silence only fueled me more. I started planning my next step carefully. I had already created ripples. Now I wanted waves. I began acquiring small shares in their business quietly, using proxies, making sure my name never appeared on any document. Piece by piece, I gained leverage, pulling strings from behind the curtain without them realizing I was the one holding the threads. The more I pulled, the more tangled their world became. Meetings grew tense. Investors questioned every decision. Suppliers started demanding upfront payments. Their carefully painted picture of success began cracking at the edges, and for the first time, I saw fear replace arrogance in their eyes. One evening, I went to a local cafe where some of the business investors often gathered. I sat quietly in a corner, listening as one of them spoke about pulling out of the project entirely. His words carried weight, and I knew the storm I'd started had now taken a life of its own. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law tried desperately to hold on to her collapsing social standing. She posted photos online of expensive dinners and glamorous vacations, pretending everything was perfect, but people weren't buying it anymore. Behind the filters and forced smiles, cracks showed. People noticed. They always do. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I simply waited. Because panic is just the beginning. I wanted them to live in fear for a while, to feel the uncertainty gnawing at their perfect lives, to question every decision, every move, every friend. I wanted them to feel powerless. Every night, I sat on my balcony, the cool breeze brushing against my face, and thought about that evening when her hand struck my cheek and my son's silence crushed me more than the slap itself. That memory fueled me, but I didn't act out of pure anger anymore. This was calculation, precision, control. I was no longer reacting. I was orchestrating. And they didn't even know the symphony had begun. The panic had set in, but I wasn't satisfied yet. Cracks in their world weren't enough. I wanted the entire foundation to collapse beneath their feet. To do that, I needed to move from whispers to action, from shadows to control. Over the past few weeks, I had quietly bought small portions of my son's company through proxies. It was like collecting puzzle pieces one by one, and now, I finally had enough to make a decisive move. The beauty of silence is that it blinds your enemies. They never see the storm coming until it's already overhead. One morning, my son walked into an emergency board meeting, expecting to lead. Instead, he walked straight into the trap I had set. While he believed he was the one making the decisions, the boardroom was now filled with people whose loyalty lay elsewhere, with me. I wasn't present physically, but my influence sat in every chair around that table. When the meeting ended, his control was gone. Quietly, efficiently, and without a single confrontation, I stripped him of the authority he thought was untouchable. The man who once looked down on me was now just a spectator in the empire he thought he built. I imagined the look on his face when he realized it. Shock first, then confusion, and finally, the creeping dread of powerlessness. The same dread I felt that night when his silence broke me. But this wasn't just about the company. This was personal, and my daughter-in-law was next. Her world revolved around appearances, and I knew exactly where to aim. I contacted a few people in her social circle, the ones she used to humiliate with her arrogance, the ones she believed were beneath her. It didn't take much to ignite old resentments. Within days, her carefully polished image began to corrode. Rumors spread like wildfire, the kind she couldn't control. The whispers of financial instability had already made people wary, but now there was something worse: mockery. The same friends who once envied her designer outfits and lavish vacations were now laughing behind her back. And I made sure she knew it. She stopped attending social gatherings altogether. The queen had lost her throne, and without her status, she had nothing left to hide behind. My son, meanwhile, was drowning. The company's investors demanded answers he couldn't give. Clients started pulling out, one after another. For years, he had believed my silence meant weakness, but now he understood it meant preparation. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I could have reached out to him then. I could have offered help, a lifeline, a chance to rebuild. But I didn't. I let him sit with the weight of his choices, the same way he let me sit in silence the day his wife humiliated me. And yet, the final blow hadn't even landed. One evening, I received a call from an associate I had placed inside his company. He told me their biggest investor was considering walking away completely if they didn't stabilize soon. That was my cue. I met with the investor personally the next day, over dinner at a quiet restaurant, and after a long, subtle conversation, he decided to withdraw immediately. That single decision was the spark that set everything on fire. Within a week, my son's company spiraled into chaos. Deadlines missed. Projects cancelled. Panic everywhere. He was cornered, trapped in a storm he couldn't control, and for the first time in his life, he had no one to turn to, not even me. I stood by my window that night, looking at the city lights shimmering in the distance, and felt something I hadn't felt since that slap, a deep, quiet satisfaction. But this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of their fall. I wanted them to feel the same helplessness they forced upon me, the same pain, the same humiliation, but theirs would be drawn out, stretched across every part of their lives until they couldn't escape it. The foundation beneath their feet was gone. Now, it was time to pull the roof down. The storm I had unleashed was now in full swing, and there was no stopping it. What began as quiet whispers had turned into a roaring avalanche, and my son and his wife were standing directly in its path. Their empire, the life they built on arrogance and betrayal, was crumbling piece by piece, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The company was the first to collapse. Investors began pulling out one after another, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The calls my son used to receive from business partners promising growth and success were replaced with harsh demands and angry ultimatums. The people who once praised him now avoided him entirely. The young visionary they once admired had become a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. At home, things were even worse. My daughter-in-law, who once walked like a queen, now moved like a shadow. Her social circle had abandoned her completely. The same friends who used to admire her expensive handbags and glamorous vacations now laughed quietly at her downfall. And I made sure she heard those whispers. The woman who slapped me, who looked at me like I was beneath her, was now suffocating under the same humiliation she had once handed me. The house they once flaunted was no longer filled with laughter and celebration. It had turned into a battlefield. I heard from a distant cousin that they fought constantly now, arguments so loud the neighbors could hear. She blamed him for the failed investments, for not protecting their image, for letting their perfect life collapse. He blamed her for pushing him into risks he couldn't afford, for poisoning his mind, for pulling him away from his family. I imagined the scene vividly, the expensive chandelier above them, swinging gently while their voices clashed beneath it. The empire they built together had become a cage, trapping them inside as it fell apart. And I didn't lift a single finger. I let the chaos consume them while I remained silent, watching from the distance like an architect admiring the precision of his design. Every thread I pulled was invisible, every whisper perfectly timed, every move calculated. They thought their destruction came from bad luck or poor choices, but I knew the truth. The storm wasn't random. I was the storm. Soon, the cracks in their finances reached the point of no return. They were forced to sell off their luxury car, pawn jewelry, and cut down on their lavish expenses just to survive. Their social media, once filled with pictures of vacations, expensive dinners, and parties, became silent. They didn't want the world to know the truth, but the world already knew. I could have stopped it. I could have offered a hand, stepped in like the father I once was, and saved them from drowning. But I didn't. Because this wasn't just revenge anymore. This was justice. I remembered that night, the sting on my cheek, the silence of my son, the coldness in their eyes, and every time those memories surfaced, my resolve deepened. They thought they broke me, but all they did was awaken a part of me they didn't know existed. And yet, despite all the chaos, I still wasn't done. The company's downfall was satisfying, yes, but I wanted something deeper. I wanted them to understand what respect truly meant. I wanted them to feel the weight of every sacrifice I made, every sleepless night I endured for them, every ounce of love I had poured into their lives, only to be discarded like I was nothing. I wanted them to live with the knowledge that the person they humiliated was the same person who orchestrated their fall. But not yet. Not until they were truly broken. So, I waited. I watched as their life continued to spiral downward, debts piling up, friends disappearing, nights growing colder. I waited until the silence between them grew louder than their arguments, until the house that once echoed with arrogance turned into a tomb of regret. And when the time came, when the walls had finally closed in around them, I knew exactly what my next move would be. The slap they gave me had set this in motion. But the next blow. That one would finish it. The day finally came. The moment I had been waiting for, the moment when pride would collapse, arrogance would vanish, and desperation would walk straight to my door. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the clouds sit heavy and low, as though even the sky wants to hide its face. I was sitting near the window, sipping my tea slowly, watching droplets race down the glass, when I heard the knock. A soft, hesitant knock, not the bold pounding I was used to from them. I opened the door, and there they stood, my son and his wife. They didn't look like the same people who once stood tall in their fortress of pride. My son, once polished and confident, now had dark circles under his eyes, his shoulders slumped, his clothes wrinkled. My daughter-in-law, the queen who once commanded rooms with her presence, now looked hollow, stripped of her shine. Her makeup was smudged from tears she probably tried to hide, and the arrogance that once danced in her eyes had been replaced with quiet panic. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the silence hang between us. They expected anger, shouting, accusations, but I gave them nothing. Sometimes silence is heavier than words. Finally, my son lowered his head, his voice barely audible as he stumbled through apologies. Apologies for not standing up for me. Apologies for choosing pride over respect. Apologies for letting his wife's poison turn him into a stranger I didn't recognize. And then, her turn came. My daughter-in-law, who once treated me like an unwelcome burden, struggled to speak. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw her without a mask. She wasn't the queen she pretended to be. She was just a woman standing in the ruins of her own making. I listened. Quietly. Patiently. Not a single interruption. When they finished, the silence returned. I could hear the rain outside, the ticking clock in the living room, even the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Inside, my chest felt tight, not with anger anymore, but with something deeper. Something heavier. I thought of all the nights I lay awake, reliving that slap, the humiliation, the weight of my son's silence. I thought of the sacrifices, the years of love, the sleepless nights, the dreams I carried for him. And now, standing here before me, broken and stripped of everything they once worshipped, they finally understood. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I didn't raise my hand. I looked at them and said, calmly, that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you give. That once shattered, trust doesn't rebuild overnight. I let those words hang in the air, sharp and unyielding. Their faces fell further. They were expecting forgiveness wrapped in comfort. But forgiveness is not a gift, it's a choice. And I wasn't ready to choose it. I told them to leave. No shouting. No hatred. Just cold, final silence. They walked away slowly, heads bowed, shoulders heavy, the rain soaking through their clothes as they disappeared into the grey afternoon. I stood at the doorway long after they left, the damp breeze brushing my face, watching the ripples on the wet street. Inside, I didn't feel joy. Not yet. I didn't want their suffering for the sake of cruelty. I wanted them to learn, to feel, to carry the same weight they had placed on me. And judging by the look in their eyes, they finally did. But I wasn't done. They had lost their pride, their friends, their wealth, and their empire. But one thing remained untouched: the house. The same house where I was humiliated, the same house where my dignity was crushed under their arrogance. And I knew, in my heart, that the final blow had to come from there. I wanted them to watch as the very roof they lorded over me became theirs no longer. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. And soon, balance would be restored. The rain that day didn't wash away their sins, it only prepared the ground for what was coming next. They had begged, apologized, and tried to mask their shame, but apologies don't erase humiliation. Forgiveness doesn't come wrapped in tears. It must be earned. And they hadn't earned anything. Not yet. I sat in my living room late that night, the sound of raindrops still pattering against the window, as I stared at the documents spread across my table. Property deeds. Financial statements. Mortgage records. Every thread of their so-called perfect life was tangled right here in front of me, and I finally held all the strings. The house. That cursed house where my dignity had been ripped apart, where the sting of my daughter-in-law's slap burned into my memory, where my son sat frozen like a stranger while my respect turned to dust. That house had become the symbol of everything they thought they controlled. Taking it wasn't just revenge, it was justice. I contacted a close friend in real estate, someone I trusted, someone who owed me more than one favor. Together, we devised the plan. Quietly, cleanly, legally. They had already mortgaged the property heavily to cover business debts, and the numbers were merciless. A few strategic moves, a well-timed purchase, and I secured full ownership of the house without them even knowing my name was behind it. Weeks later, the notice went out. I can still imagine the moment they received it. My son, opening the envelope, his face pale, his hands trembling as he read the words that shattered the last piece of their empire. My daughter-in-law standing behind him, her voice rising, her world spinning, as reality sank in. The house wasn't theirs anymore. For the first time, they tasted the same helplessness I felt that night. They knew what it meant to lose control, to stand in the ruins of what they believed was untouchable. I didn't show up at their door. Not yet. I wanted them to sit with it, to breathe in the loss, to feel the weight pressing on their chests. I wanted them to realize they had built their lives on borrowed pride and borrowed wealth, and now it was gone. Their friends knew. The whispers grew louder. People started saying things they couldn't bear to hear. The queen who once mocked others for living beneath her was now homeless in spirit, stripped of everything but her shame. My son, who once believed silence made him safe, now understood that silence has a price, and he was paying it. Days later, I visited the property quietly, standing outside the gates as the sun dipped below the horizon. The once lively home was silent now. Curtains drawn. Lights dimmed. The laughter and arrogance that once spilled from those walls had been replaced by emptiness. For a long moment, I stood there, breathing in the stillness, feeling the ache of old wounds stitched shut with quiet satisfaction. I didn't smile. This wasn't joy. This was balance, the kind you only find when life finally rights its wrongs. And yet, as I turned to leave, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had taken everything back, the respect, the control, the dignity they thought they'd destroyed. But one thing remained unfinished. They still didn't know it was me. All this time, I had moved like a shadow, a ghost haunting their steps without leaving a trace. But shadows can't teach lessons. Sometimes, the face behind the fall has to be revealed. I decided then that the final meeting would come. The day I would look them in the eye, not with anger, not with hatred, but with quiet, devastating truth. They would know. They would finally understand who brought down their empire. And when that day came, it wouldn't be for revenge anymore. It would be for closure. The day of reckoning came on a quiet afternoon, months after I had taken the house, the company, and their carefully constructed pride. The sun hung low, painting the sky in pale amber, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I sat in my living room, calm, steady, sipping tea when the knock came. This time, it wasn't hesitant. It was desperate. I opened the door, and there they were again, my son and his wife. But they weren't the same people who once humiliated me in that house. No, these were shadows of their former selves, stripped of wealth, stripped of friends, stripped of the arrogant glow they once wore so proudly. My son's shoulders slumped, his hands clenched, his face pale and tired. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world, except this time, there was no expensive car outside, no false pride shining in his eyes. My daughter-in-law stood slightly behind him, quiet, her head lowered, her presence so small compared to the woman who once demanded the world kneel to her. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. I could see their guilt, their regret, and their exhaustion written across their faces. But I gave them nothing, not a smile, not anger, not pity. Just silence. Finally, my son spoke, his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before. He admitted everything, the arrogance, the mistakes, the way he had allowed pride to destroy the bond between us. He said he understood now what loyalty meant, what respect meant, and how blind he had been. My daughter-in-law, the same woman who once raised her hand against me, finally found her words too. She didn't defend herself. She didn't offer excuses. She simply admitted she had been wrong, that her hunger for status had poisoned her judgment, poisoned their marriage, poisoned everything. I listened quietly, my face calm, but inside, my heart felt heavy with memories. That slap. That humiliation. That silence. The nights I lay awake, wondering where I had failed, wondering why the boy I raised turned into a stranger. I thought of the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the choices I made so he could have a better life. Only for him to stand by while my dignity was crushed. I let them speak until their voices faded into the stillness of my living room. Then, slowly, I placed the property deed on the table between us. Their eyes widened when they saw it. Recognition dawned. They finally understood who had orchestrated everything, the whispers, the financial downfall, the company's collapse, the loss of the house. Their faces drained of color. I looked at them and said, calmly, that revenge was never my first choice. But respect isn't optional, it's earned. And when they stripped me of mine, I had no choice but to show them what it feels like to lose everything they thought was untouchable. They sat there in silence, my words sinking deeper than any slap ever could. My son's hands trembled as he reached for the deed, but I didn't let him touch it. I told him something he would never forget. Dignity once shattered takes a lifetime to rebuild, and until he understood that, the house wasn't his to claim. I saw tears in his eyes for the first time since he was a child. My daughter-in-law turned away, covering her face, the weight of shame too heavy to bear. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than every word they ever used against me. After a long pause, I stood and walked to the door. I didn't push them out, but they understood. They left quietly, heads bowed, carrying with them the truth of everything they had lost, not just wealth, not just status, but the respect and love they had thrown away so carelessly. I closed the door behind them and stood there for a while, the evening sunlight casting long shadows across the floor. There was no rush of victory, no wild celebration. What I felt was deeper, quieter, heavier, a strange mix of sorrow and satisfaction. I sat back in my chair, sipped the last of my tea, and watched the light fade outside. My revenge wasn't loud or violent. It was slow, deliberate, and absolute. And for the first time since that slap, I felt whole again. The house was mine. My dignity was mine. And, most importantly, my peace was mine. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. That's free and only way to support us. Thank you.